Is this thing on? If you use peptides or are curious, there is a meeting this week that may be one of the most important meetings that you haven't heard of. On July 23rd and 24th, 2026, the FDA's Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee is going to be meeting to discuss 7 therapeutic peptides. Now, here are the facts. This is not an approval meeting, it's not a meeting to ban peptides, and nothing is going to immediately change based on the outcome of these 2 days. Instead, this committee has been asked to review available scientific evidence for these peptides and make a recommendation to the FDA whether or not they should be added to the 503A bulks list. That list is what determines whether or not a 503A compounding pharmacy can routinely compound these substances from bulk ingredients under federal law. During this meeting, the committee will hear from FDA scientists, researchers, clinicians, invited guests, members of the public, before they make their recommendation. One of those invited speakers is LEMD's founder and CEO, Honey Sagari, and she's going to be talking about the importance of continued patient access to these therapies. So, why does this meeting matter? Well, while this meeting won't immediately change access, it could very well influence the future of peptide medicine and where it goes from here. Over the next few videos, I'm going to explain what's being debated, why the current regulations are so confusing, and why this hearing could impact patients for years to come. I've seen people saying that these peptides are either completely legal or completely illegal, and the truth is much more complicated. None of these peptides are FDA approved drugs. They're also not currently included on the FDA's 503A bulks list, which means there isn't clear federal authorization for pharmacies to compound these substances from bulk ingredients. That's why many people describe this as a regulatory gray area. Here's why. Doctors practice medicine, state boards regulate pharmacies, the FDA regulates drug manufacturing and compounding, and those are 3 different systems that overlap. So, a physician may believe a peptide may be appropriate for a patient. A pharmacy may believe that it has a legal basis to compound it, but another pharmacy may believe that the regulatory risk is too high and refuse to offer it. And that's why patients hear completely different things depending on where they go. This hearing exists because the FDA is trying to determine what the future should look like, not necessarily because peptides have suddenly become dangerous. And that is an important distinction. I spent some time reading through the FDA's briefing documents. You're welcome. Honestly, they weren't what I expected. The FDA isn't saying that these peptides don't work. Instead, the FDA is saying that there isn't enough evidence to support routine pharmacy compounding. Across all 7 peptides, the same concerns keep popping up. There's not enough high quality human clinical trials. There's questions about manufacturing consistency, questions about purity and impurities, questions about stability, and there's just limited long term safety data. The FDA also points out that some of these published studies don't actually match what products people are using today. For example, if a study looked at an intranasal peptide, that doesn't exactly tell us that the same peptide is safe for subcutaneous injections. And whether you agree with the FDA's conclusions or not, it is important to understand what they are actually arguing. This isn't an argument that peptides have zero potential, but it is an argument that the FDA doesn't believe that there's enough significant evidence to support routine compounding. And those are 2 very different conversations. I don't think that this is a hearing about these 7 peptides. I think it's a hearing about the future and what comes next. If the advisory committee recommends against adding these peptides to the 503A bulk list, and the FDA ultimately adopts that recommendation, access through traditional compounding pharmacies could become very limited. It doesn't mean that people taking peptides suddenly lose access the next day, but it could make it much harder for patients to obtain these therapies through traditional compounding pharmacies over time. And here's the question that I keep asking myself. If people believe these therapies are helping them, what happens if regulated access becomes more limited? Some people may stop treatment. Some may transition to FDA approved therapies if there are some available, but others will begin looking elsewhere. That could mean research chemical websites, international suppliers, or underground labs. And those sources don't necessarily operate under the same standards that licensed compounding pharmacies do. That doesn't mean that every product outside of a compounding pharmacy is unsafe, but it does mean that patients often have less transparency and less safeguards. To me, that is why this hearing matters, because this conversation isn't about 7 peptides. It's about where patients may turn if regulated access becomes more limited. I also think it's significant that LEMD's founder and CEO, Honey Sagari, has been invited to speak before this committee. The committee isn't only hearing from FDA scientists. They're hearing from clinicians and researchers and healthcare professionals and patients. I think they're trying to understand both the science and the real world impact that these decisions could have. And whether you support broader access or stronger regulation, I think we can all agree on one thing. Patients deserve safe and transparent access to the therapies that they choose to pursue. And if people are going to seek peptide therapies anyway, it's worth asking where the access is the safest. And I'll be following these hearings closely. And when they're over, I'll break down what happened, what the committee recommended, what it means today, and what could happen next. Today might be one of the biggest days we've seen for PEPs in years. If you've been following the FDA hearings, you might have heard that BPC 157 has passed. But what exactly does that mean? Let's talk about it. First, this does not mean that BPC 157 is FDA approved. It also doesn't mean that you can suddenly get it everywhere tomorrow. What happened today is the FDA's Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee recommended BPC to be added to the 503A bulks compounding list. Think of it like this. This committee just gave the FDA a thumbs up, but the FDA still has a final say. So why is everyone paying attention to this? Well, for the past few years, BPC has been in a regulatory gray area. Many people have turned to the gray market to get research meds. There wasn't really a clear pathway for this to be used in compounding pharmacies legally. And if the FDA ultimately follows today's recommendation, it could create a legitimate pathway for these meds to be used in compounding pharmacies. That won't mean it's approved for every condition, and it also doesn't mean that the FDA has declared it as proven to work, and it definitely doesn't mean that this process is over. Ultimately, the FDA can accept, modify, or reject this committee's recommendation. But today's vote is significant because it moves us forward. And there's a bigger picture here. BPC is only one of 7 peptides that are being reviewed over these 2 days, and how the committee approaches these peptides, it's gonna shape the future of peptide compounding in the United States for years to come. They're voting for KPV now, so I'll come back with the results for that one. Breaking news, KPV just had a big day at the FDA. The Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee just voted 8 yes, 6 no, and 1 abstention to add KPV freebase and KPV acetate to the 503A bulks list. And that's significant because the FDA's own briefing document recommended against it. But after hearing presentations and reviewing evidence, this committee has voted in favor of recommending it to that list. But I want to tell you what I found interesting. The votes were split kind of by your title. Many of the PhDs voted no, while the MDs and the DOs voted yes. It's not a criticism of either group, it's just an observation. The PhDs, or the scientists, appeared to focus on whether the published evidence met the level of certainty that they wanted, while the physicians appeared to weigh the evidence based on what they were seeing in real-world application with their patients. And I think it's a fascinating difference in perspective. To be clear, this is not an FDA approval. The committee's recommendation is advisory, and the FDA still gets to decide on whether or not they accept these recommendations. But this is now another favorable recommendation following BPC, and there are still 5 more peptides on the list. They've gone to lunch, but when they come back, we'll see what's next. It's my Super Bowl. All right, it's official. TB500 has received enough votes to be recommended to the FDA to be added to the 503A bulks list. And today's discussion around TB500 was my favorite one to listen to so far. When the committee started asking questions, one thing became very clear. We are lacking human clinical study data. So what did the FDA do? They just continued to reference TB4, thymosin beta 4, which is the naturally occurring protein that TB500 is designed to mimic. Essentially, some of the committee members were asking, can we actually use research from TB4 whenever we're discussing TB500? I just think it was really interesting and eye-opening to hear those arguments. And when it came all the way back around to it, the vote was 8 yes, 6 no, and 1 abstention. Again, this is not not an FDA approval, but it is a recommendation from the FDA's Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee to add this PEP to the 503A bulks list. And it is still up to the FDA on whether they accept, modify, or reject that recommendation. Right now, MOTS-C is on the docket. They're talking about it. I'll come back whenever they have a decision. That was a nail biter. The last PEP that the FDA's Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee reviewed today was MOTS-C. And after every presentation, every public speaker, and the FDA's whole spiel, I didn't think that one was going to get through, but it did. 7 yeses, 5 nos, and 2 abstentions, which means that this committee is now recommending MOTS-C to the FDA to be added to the 503A bulks list. Again, I need to make this clear. This is not an FDA approval. This is a recommendation to be added to a list so that compounding pharmacies can legally compound without any repercussions. And this recommendation is just that. It's a recommendation. The FDA can ultimately decide to either approve, modify, or reject. If you are keeping count, there are 7 PEPs that are up for discussion, and today 4 of them voted through to be recommended to the 503A bulks list. And I guess we'll see what tomorrow has in store. It's day 2 of the FDA's PCAC meeting, and we've experienced our first loss. DSIP, known as imedeltide, was just voted down against recommendation to the 503A bulks list. DSIP, or delta sleep-inducing peptide, is a naturally occurring peptide that has been studied for its effect on deep sleep, insomnia, narcolepsy, and opioid withdrawal. But the research on DSIP is very limited, and this committee was presented with evidence, and they're not saying that they don't have the evidence to prove that it works. What they're saying is they don't have the evidence to prove just how well it works. This does not mean that DSIP was banned today. This committee's goal is to make a recommendation to the FDA to either add to or not add to the 503A bulks list, which would make this substance legally compoundable by compounding pharmacies. And if the FDA adopts this recommendation on DSIP, then it will just make it extremely difficult for compounding pharmacies to use this bulk substance. There are 2 more PEPs on the docket today. Right now they're talking about epitalon. I will come back when there is a decision. The FDA's Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee just passed their favorable recommendation for epitalon to be added to the 503A bulks list. One of my favorite moments from this part of the hearing was when one of the public speakers got up and said, I quote, "Just because you don't like something doesn't mean you should take it away from someone else." I also think that some of these committee members were diplomatically critical of the FDA presenters. This committee is made up of both practicing physicians and research scientists and a couple of other outliers. And the physicians are the ones that are advocating for this, when I am seeing the scientists are the ones who are saying they need more data. So if you are keeping count, we have 5 favorable recommendations to the 503A bulks list. We have 1 not favorable recommendation, and we have 1 to go. So we'll see what CMAX says next. The votes are in, and CMAX has officially been approved for recommendation to the 503A bulks list by the Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee, and I'm pretty excited. While I am trying to stay neutral, as a former journalist, this hearing on CMAX was a lot of fun to watch. Not only did the public speakers come through and present that there are over 40 years of studies on this particular substance, some of the committee members expressed their disappointment in the way that the FDA approached their presentation. For example, the FDA said that there were several studies that were in Russian and they didn't have English abstracts to understand what the Russian studies said. And one of the committee members commented that he had just done a quick search on Claude and was able to find all of the translations of those abstracts. And then in the closing comments, he basically said they were lazy. He plugged Claude and said, you should probably try to use this next time. All in all, I think that this is the one that had the most data around it, so I was not surprised to see it get approved for recommendation. Now it's in the FDA's hands.